Keller says, C.S. Lewis described how he had originally rejected the idea of God because of the cruelty of life. Then he came to realize that evil was even more problematic for his new atheism. In the end, he realized that suffering provided a better argument for God's existence than against it. Now, how is that even possible? Well, Lewis says, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? What are the reference points? Yeah. See, if you are having a hard time with how does the Christian faith explain the problem of evil and suffering, that's fine. But just remember, every other worldview has to explain the same thing, right? So in other words, don't just say, well, Christianity must explain. Everyone must. So let's take your worldview, whatever it might be. Let's take a predominant one in this culture, naturalism, that the universe is the product of time plus chance plus nothing, randomness, okay? So how living in a random universe where life operates on the basis of natural selection and the survival of the fittest, how can you explain goodness? Human goodness. You could certainly explain why when we see a disabled person, we would kill them because it's survival of the fittest. But I'm not sure that really explains why we have handicap parking and why we have Special Olympics and why people show tenderness to people in need. How does it explain how American surgeons that could make however many hundreds of thousands of dollars a year going and devoting their lives to work with lepers in India? Why don't you just let them die? Isn't that what natural selection's about? I mean, how do you account for goodness and nobility from natural selection, survival of the fittest? So if you're a naturalist and that's your worldview, where did this goodness come from? And how do you know it's goodness at all? What is your reference point? Isn't it just whatever is? Or how do you explain extreme evil? Oh, you could explain through natural selection just neglecting people or even devouring people and getting rid of people. But could you explain torture, and not even torture to get information, but just out of sheer cruelty, the things that people do? Could you explain what happened in Charleston? What is it? How does this young man profit? How does he come out ahead in these evil acts he's committed, and even the fact that we're calling them evil? Well, what do you mean? Why not? Why isn't that choice just as good as every other choice? What's your standard? Anytime you say there's evil, you're saying there's a standard of goodness by which you're judging it. Well, where does that standard of goodness come from? Through atoms and time and chance and nothing and natural selection? Does that give you your standard of... No, what happens is, every time somebody argues against the Christian worldview, you'll see this happen again and again. They'll say, well, I don't believe, because Christianity, and there's been the Crusades, and there's been these terrible things that Christians have done. And yeah, professing Christians have done a lot of terrible things, no doubt about it. Sometimes they weren't genuine Christians, maybe sometimes they were, but terrible things have been done. But wait a minute. How can you judge those things as being evil? They're just part of this natural world of randomness that requires no explanation. So you're holding God accountable to standards that can only be explained by the existence of God. Where does goodness come from? Well, if it's rooted in God and his character, that's what Lewis is saying. How did I get this idea of just and unjust? What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? He said, consequently, atheism turns out to be too simple. So in other words, how do you... By the way, the Christian faith definitely accounts for the problem of extreme good, it's rooted in God, and extreme evil, superhuman evil. It's the existence of the devil, Satan, demons. So when I was in Cambodia and I walked through the killing fields and I saw where millions of people were butchered and things beyond imagination, where I'm literally standing amongst human bones, and I'm looking down at the skulls, and people don't even know who these people were because they lost track because of all of the slaughter. And there's this one sign in Cambodian, and there's this sign in English, and it says, "Who could do the things that were done? They did not have the hearts of men. They had the hearts of demons." You cannot explain through naturalism extreme evil of that sort. You can't explain a Hitler by that. But the Christian faith actually can explain both the extreme goodness and the extreme evil. And I think ultimately the Christian worldview has a better understanding of and explanation for evil and the problem of evil and suffering than any other worldview. It has greater explanatory power than any other worldview. Stack up. I've studied other worldviews. I encourage you to study. I'm never going to figure out what anybody else thinks because I'm just going to stay in my little solitary Christian world and just hope for the best. No, go ahead and explore those things, but stack them up against the Bible, and I believe if you look at it seriously, you'll find there's no better worldview with more explanatory power than this one.